Husband chose sister's lies over wife's truth. Pregnant wife betrayed and kicked out. Quadruplets changed the story. What happened in the end? Welcome, beautiful souls. New here. Drop your beautiful name below. We'd love to meet you. Returning family, you know how much you mean to us. Don't forget to subscribe and join our journey of love, miracles, and healing. Every story is chosen with your heart in mind. Now, take a deep breath. Our tale of a lifetime begins. Golden rays painted shadow dragons across the polished marble floors of Jack's Industries executive suite as the glass and steel fortress pierced the Birmingham skyline like a modern-day castle, its reflective surfaces throwing back the golden Alabama sunset. On the top floor, Calamity Jack stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, a crystal tumbler of aged whiskey in his hand, watching his kingdom below. At 32, he'd built an empire that most men twice his age could only dream of, yet the bitter edge of restlessness never seemed to leave his expensive drinks. The name Calamity had started as a joke in boarding school, the boy who brought chaos wherever he went. Now it was whispered in boardrooms across the southeast with a mixture of fear and admiration. His seemingly reckless business decisions had an uncanny way of transforming into gold, earning him the nickname the Alchemist of Alabama in financial circles. Today's acquisition had been particularly satisfying. The Thompson Group had thought themselves untouchable right until the moment Calamity orchestrated their hostile takeover during their CEO's daughter's wedding. "Business is business," he'd said, raising a toast at the reception while signing the final papers. The move had added another billion to his net worth, pushing him firmly into the ranks of America's youngest multi-billionaires. His office told the story of his success: African mahogany desk, hand-knotted Persian carpet, and walls adorned with strategically placed modern art pieces, each item carefully chosen to project power, wealth, and sophisticated taste. But it was the small, leather-bound notebook in his desk drawer that held his true trophies, a list of conquests that had nothing to do with business. Sarah Mitchell's name was still visible despite his attempt to cross it out months ago. She'd been brilliant. He had to give her that. The investment banker with a mind sharp enough to match his own. Their 3-month whirlwind had ended the day she mentioned looking at houses in Mountain Brook. He'd simply stopped answering her calls, changed his private number, and moved on. The last he'd heard, she'd taken a position in London, unable to face the whispers that followed her through Birmingham's financial district. Rebecca Chen had lasted slightly longer. The gallery owner had an eye for beauty that matched her own striking looks. She'd transformed his office and penthouse with exquisite pieces, each one telling a story of culture and refinement. The end came when she suggested combining their businesses, proposing a chain of high-end galleries across the South. He'd had his security team escort her out, her carefully curated art collection replaced within a week. Isabella Torres had been different, or so he'd thought at the time. The architect had approached their relationship like she did her buildings, with precision, passion, and an eye toward the future. She'd designed his new headquarters, integrating sustainability with luxury in a way that had earned international acclaim. The night she'd left the ultrasound picture on his desk was the night he'd had his secretary inform her that their personal and professional relationship was terminated. Running his fingers through his perfectly styled dark hair, Calamity allowed himself a moment of reflection. The city lights below twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing a life touched, or more often disrupted, by his ambitions. His phone buzzed with messages from the day's conquest, the CEO's daughter herself, seeking comfort after her ruined wedding day. He deleted the messages without reading them. The marriage trap, as he called it, had nearly caught him 3 times now. Each woman eventually revealed the same fatal flaw. They wanted more than he was willing to give. They wanted the fairy tale, the ring, the house, the happily ever after, What they failed to understand was that men like Calamity Jacks didn't do happily ever after. They did power moves and profit margins, hostile takeovers and strategic retreats. His childhood had taught him that lesson well enough. Growing up in the shadow of Calamity Castle, watching his father navigate their family's crumbling fortune through 3 marriages, he'd learned that love was just another form of leverage. His mother, the first Mrs. Jacks, had left when he was 5, choosing her art career over family obligations. The second had stayed long enough to drain a significant portion of the family trust. Before running off with her yoga instructor, the third had actually loved his father, which made it all the more tragic when cancer took her just 2 years into their marriage. Mia, his older sister, had been the only constant. She'd raised him more than any of their father's wives, fierce in her protection and unrelenting in her standards. "Never trust a woman who claims to love you," she'd told him after the second Mrs. Jacks's departure. "They all want something, little brother. Make sure you know what it is before they do." The evening cleaning crew had arrived, their quiet efficiency a reminder of the late hour. Calamity checked his Patek Philippe watch, nearly midnight, and he still had proposals to review before tomorrow's board meeting. His personal assistant, Marcus, had left a neat stack of folders on his desk, each one representing another potential acquisition, another company to add to his growing empire. The first folder contained information about a chain of high-end beauty salons, the Crown Beauty Group. Their financials showed potential, but what caught his eye was the location of their flagship store, right in the heart of Highland Park. He'd been meaning to expand into the personal luxury services sector, and this could be the perfect opportunity. "Marcus," he called, knowing his PA would still be at his desk, despite the hour. The younger man appeared instantly, tablet in hand. "Schedule a visit to Crown Beauty's flagship location tomorrow. Let's see what we're working with." "Of course, Mr. Jacks. Would you prefer morning or afternoon?" Calamity turned back to the city lights, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Make it late morning. And Marcus, make sure my calendar is clear afterward. I have a feeling tomorrow might be interesting." As his PA left, Calamity loosened his Italian silk tie. Tomorrow would bring another conquest, another addition to his empire. Whether it would be business or pleasure remained to be seen. In his experience, the two often went hand in hand. The night stretched ahead of him, full of possibilities and empty of meaning. But that was exactly how Calamity Jacks liked it. Uncomplicated, unattached, and entirely under his control. Little did he know, fate had other plans, and they were about to walk into his life wearing a salon apron and carrying a pair of scissors. The weight of Calamity Castle's legacy pressed down on him, even from 20 miles away. The ancestral home of the Jacks family stood as a testament to old money and older secrets, its Gothic revival architecture a stark contrast to his modern domain of glass and steel. He'd spent millions renovating it after reclaiming the family fortune, yet somehow its shadows still held the echoes of his father's failures and his mother's departures. His phone buzzed again, Mia this time. His sister's weekly check-in was as predictable as her disapproval of his lifestyle. From her self-imposed exile in Australia, she managed to maintain an iron grip on their family's social obligations. He let the call go to voicemail, already knowing what she'd say. "Little brother, the Calamity name means something. When are you going to start acting like it?" The cleaning crew's vacuum created a white noise that transported him back to another night, another office 15 years ago. He'd been 17, sneaking into his father's study at Calamity Castle, determined to understand why their family's empire was crumbling. The papers he'd found that night had changed everything. Evidence of embezzlement, poor investments, and desperate attempts to maintain an image of prosperity, while their fortune bled away. That night had birthed his obsession with control. He'd spent the next 5 years learning everything he could about business, finance, and the art of acquisition. Harvard Business School had taught him the fundamentals, but the real education came from watching his father's final attempts to save their legacy. The old man had died thinking his son would carry on the family's slow decline into genteel poverty. Instead, calamity had turned their remaining assets into the foundation of an empire that would make the old Jack's fortune look like pocket change. Sarah Mitchell had been there at the beginning. He allowed himself to remember her now, brilliant, ambitious, and ultimately too perceptive for her own good. They'd met at a merger and acquisition conference in New York, her analysis of market trends matching his own predictions point for point. Their romance had burned hot and fast, fueled by late-night strategy sessions and dawn celebrations of successful deals. "You're scared," she'd said the night before he cut her off. "Not of commitment, of losing control. You'd rather break something perfectly good than risk it breaking you." Her words had hit too close to home, so he'd done what he did best, eliminated the threat before it could take root. Rebecca Chen had been a calculated risk. Her gallery was making waves in the international art scene, and he'd convinced himself that their relationship was about business synergy. She'd filled his life with beauty, transforming his sterile penthouse into a showcase of contemporary art that told stories of passion and pain. The irony that she'd chosen pieces that reflected his inner turmoil hadn't escaped him. The night she'd suggested merging their businesses, he'd seen the trap for what it was. Art was subjective, emotional, unpredictable, everything he'd fought to eliminate from his life. The next morning, her access codes had been revoked, her carefully curated collection replaced with safe, corporate-approved pieces that said nothing and meant even less. Isabella Torres had almost been his undoing. The architect had approached their relationship like she approached her designs, with careful planning and an eye toward the future. She'd understood his need for control, integrating it into her plans for his new headquarters. The building around him was her vision of their future together, strong, transparent, reaching for the sky while remaining firmly grounded. The ultrasound picture had shattered that illusion. A child meant chaos, unpredictability, emotions he couldn't control. He'd handled it like any other hostile takeover, swiftly and without mercy. His lawyers had ensured that the generous settlement came with ironclad NDAs. The last he'd heard, she'd moved to Chicago, his child becoming another city's architectural marvel. Marcus reappeared at his door, tablet glowing with updates. "Sir, I've scheduled your visit to Crown Beauty for 11 a.m. tomorrow. Also, Ms. Flora left a message. She's planning to return from Australia next month. She mentioned something about family obligations that require your attention." Calamity's jaw tightened at the mention of his sister's impending return. Mia Flora, née Jax, had a way of complicating his carefully ordered world. Her own marriage to Australian mining magnate James Flora had been a business arrangement worthy of the Jax name, but lately her calls had carried hints of trouble in paradise. "Thank you, Marcus. Push my afternoon meetings tomorrow. After the salon visit, I want to review the Thompson Group integration plans. Their tech division has some redundancies we need to address." As his PA retreated, Calamity walked to the wet bar and poured another measure of whiskey. Tomorrow's salon visit was just another piece in his expansion plans, another move in the endless game of acquisition and control. The Highland Park location would give him a foothold in the luxury services sector, adding another diverse stream of revenue to his holdings. Yet something about tomorrow felt different. A pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Calamity Jax didn't believe in premonitions. He believed in spreadsheets, market analysis, and the power of carefully applied pressure. But as he watched the city lights twinkle below, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Tomorrow would change everything, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The night stretched ahead, filled with the ghosts of past relationships and the weight of future obligations. In his pocket, his phone buzzed one final time, a message from the Thompson Group CEO's daughter, a last desperate attempt to save her family's company. He deleted it without reading, just as he'd deleted every other emotional appeal that had crossed his path. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new conquests, new chances to prove that control was the only thing that mattered. But fate had other plans for Calamity Jacks, and they were about to walk into his life with grace, dignity, and a pair of scissors that would cut through every defense he'd ever built. Chapter 2. The Salon Encounter. Crown Beauty Salon stood like a jewel box among the trendy boutiques of Highland Avenue, its Art Deco facade a testament to old-world glamour reimagined for modern sensibilities. As Calamity's Bentley pulled up to the curb, the morning sun caught the gold-leafed lettering, creating a halo effect that seemed almost prophetic. He adjusted his Brioni suit, more out of habit than necessity, and checked his Patek Philippe watch. 10:57 a.m., perfectly early as always. The salon's interior was a masterpiece of design, blending contemporary luxury with intimate warmth. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic patterns across marble floors, while strategically placed mirrors created an illusion of endless space. The air carried notes of jasmine and sandalwood, a signature scent that spoke of exclusivity and refinement. Marcus had done his homework well. The dossier on his tablet contained everything from the salon's financial statements to the personal histories of key staff members. Crown Beauty was profitable but not thriving, caught in the limbo between high-end service and sustainable growth. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Calamity loved. A diamond in need of his particular brand of polishing. What the dossier hadn't prepared him for was Annalise Oliver. She moved between the styling stations with a grace that commanded attention without demanding it. Her fingers danced through her client's silver hair, weaving strands into an elegant updo while maintaining an engaged conversation about the woman's grandchildren. Her smile, when it came, transformed her entire face, reaching her eyes in a way that spoke of genuine warmth rather than professional courtesy. Calamity found himself frozen in the doorway, his carefully prepared introduction dying on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt oddly exposed, as if all his carefully constructed barriers had suddenly become transparent. He watched as she secured the last pin in her client's hair, her movements precise and confident. "Perfect timing, Mrs. Davidson," Annalise was saying, her voice carrying notes of both strength and gentleness. "You'll be the most elegant grandmother at the graduation ceremony." Her accent carried just a hint of something exotic, perhaps Caribbean, mixed with years of American education. The elderly woman beamed at her reflection. "You're an artist, Annalise. I don't know what we'd do without you." "There are plenty of talented stylists in Birmingham," Annalise replied, but her modest deflection only seemed to enhance her competence. Calamity's presence had not gone unnoticed. Marcus Thompson, the salon manager, no relation to the recently acquired Thompson Group his mind automatically catalogued, approached with the slightly anxious energy of someone who recognized power when it walked through their door. "Mr. Jacks, welcome to Crown Beauty. We're honored to have you visit our establishment." Thompson's handshake was firm, but his palm was sweaty. "I understand you're interested in experiencing our services firsthand?" Calamity nodded, his eyes still drawn to Annalise as she helped Mrs. Davidson gather her belongings. "I believe in understanding potential investments from the ground up, Mr. Thompson. I'd like your best stylist." Thompson's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, sir. Although I should mention that Miss Oliver is fully booked for the day. Perhaps I could arrange for Madison or Jessica. They're both excellent with our VIP clients." "I'll wait." The words left Calamity's mouth before his brain had fully processed them. He never waited, for anything or anyone. Yet here he was, settling into one of the elegant waiting area chairs, picking up a magazine he had no intention of reading. The next 2 hours proved to be an education in patience and observation. He watched as Annalise moved from client to client, each interaction uniquely tailored to the individual in her chair. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did offer advice, it was with a quiet authority that seemed to put everyone at ease. What fascinated him most was her complete lack of artifice. In his world of corporate sharks and social climbers, genuine authenticity was as rare as ethical hostile takeovers. Yet here was someone who seemed utterly comfortable in her own skin, focused entirely on her craft and her client's needs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, Thompson approached again. "Mr. Jacks, I apologize for the delay. Ms. Oliver has had a cancellation for her 2 p.m. appointment. Would that be convenient?" Calamity checked his watch. He'd already missed 3 meetings and a conference call. "Perfect," he said, rising to his full height. As he approached Annalise's station, he felt an unfamiliar sensation in his stomach. It took him a moment to recognize it as nervousness. "Ms. Oliver," Thompson began the introduction, "this is Mr. Calamity Jacks. He's expressed a particular interest in experiencing your services today." Annalise turned from cleaning her station, and for the first time their eyes met directly. Her gaze was level, professional, and completely unimpressed by either his name or his obvious wealth. "Mr. Jacks," she said, gesturing to her chair, "what can I do for you today?" He settled into the leather chair, hyper-aware of her presence behind him. In the mirror, he could see her studying his reflection with professional assessment. "Just a trim," he managed, his usual smooth confidence temporarily deserting him. "Your current cut is barely a week old," she observed, running her fingers through his hair with clinical detachment. "Are you sure you need my services today?" The question caught him off guard. No one questioned his decisions, not his board members, not his employees, and certainly not service providers. Yet here was this woman, calling him out with the same ease she'd used to discuss hair products. "Perhaps what you're looking for isn't actually a haircut, Mr. Jacks," she continued, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Her gaze held a mixture of amusement and something else. Understanding, perhaps, or pity. Neither option sat well with him. "I'm looking to acquire this salon," he said bluntly, falling back on familiar territory. "I like to experience potential investments personally." "Ah," she nodded, stepping back slightly. "And how many haircuts does it take to make that decision?" A laugh escaped him before he could stop it, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "You're not what I expected, Ms. Oliver." "And what did you expect, Mr. Jacks? Someone easily impressed by expensive suits and business propositions." She began preparing her tools, her movements efficient and precise. "Now, since you're in my chair, I'm going to give you what you need rather than what you think you want. Trust me on this." Trust. The word hung between them, loaded with meaning. Trust wasn't part of Calamity Jacks's vocabulary. Not in business, not in relationships, not in life. Yet as Annalise's fingers returned to his hair, he found himself relaxing into her touch, surrendering to her expertise in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. Chapter 3. The chase money had always been Calamity Jacks's answer to everything. When you could buy anything or anyone, why waste time on subtlety? But as he stood in his penthouse office, watching his latest grand gesture being dismantled, he realized that all his billions couldn't buy what he truly wanted: Annalise Oliver's genuine attention. The rare orchids, flown in from Singapore at astronomical expense, had been donated to Children's Hospital before he could even finish his rehearsed speech about their symbolic meaning. His offer of a private helicopter tour of the city had earned him nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a gentle suggestion to find better uses for his time. The string quartet he'd hired to serenade her during her lunch break now packed their Stradivariuses away, looking as deflated as his ego felt. "Sir," Marcus appeared at his elbow, tablet in hand as always. "Ms. Oliver's charitable donation forms have been processed. The orchids will be distributed among the pediatric ward this afternoon. She's also requested that any future expressions of interest be directed to charitable causes up front to save time." Calamity loosened his tie, a gesture that had become frequent since Annalise entered his life. "She's impossible, Marcus, completely impossible," yet the words carried an undercurrent of admiration that surprised even him. "If I may, sir," Marcus ventured, "perhaps Ms. Oliver isn't impressed by what you can buy because she values what you can't." The words hit harder than any failed hostile takeover. Calamity moved to his desk, absently running his fingers over the latest acquisition reports. The Thompson Group integration was proceeding smoothly. Stock prices were up, and 3 more companies were ripe for takeover. By any measurable metric, his empire was thriving. So why did it all feel hollow? His phone buzzed. Mia again. He'd been avoiding her calls since the salon purchase, knowing his sister would see right through his business expansion justification. The last thing he needed was her particular brand of insight into his growing obsession with Annalise. The salon itself had transformed under his ownership, though not in the ways he'd expected. His initial plans for corporate modernization had been quietly but firmly redirected by Annalise's practical suggestions. She'd shown him how personal connections and community trust were assets no spreadsheet could quantify. "Your problem," Mrs. Davidson had told him during one of his many visits, "is that you think everything has a price tag." The elderly woman had become something of an unofficial advisor, dispensing wisdom between hair appointments with the kind of blunt honesty only age could justify. She wasn't wrong. His usual tactics, expensive gifts, grand gestures, power moves, seemed to bounce off Annalise like rain off a window. Each failed attempt only made him more determined, yet increasingly uncertain about his approach. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He'd arrived at the salon without an appointment, something he now did with embarrassing regularity, only to find Annalise in intense conversation with a young woman who was fighting back tears. "Listen to me, Sarah," Annalise was saying, her hands gently gripping the woman's shoulders. "You have the skills, you have the drive. This apprenticeship is just the first step. I'll mentor you myself if that's what it takes." The scene stopped him in his tracks. Here was the kind of power he understood, but had never mastered, the ability to lift others up without diminishing oneself. He watched as Annalise transformed the young woman's despair into determination, with nothing more than genuine belief and practical support. That evening, after closing, he lingered behind as Annalise cleaned her station. "The apprenticeship program," he began, choosing his words carefully. "How many students can it support?" She looked at him, with that penetrating gaze that always made him feel transparent. "With current resources, 2 per year. With proper funding and structured mentorship, we could change lives, Mr. Jacks." "Calamity," he corrected automatically. "And what would that look like? The proper funding and structure?" For the first time, he saw genuine excitement break through her professional composure. As she outlined her vision for a comprehensive training program that would give underprivileged youth a path into the beauty industry, he found himself taking mental notes with the same intensity he usually reserved for merger negotiations. 2 weeks later, the Crown Beauty Academy for Artistic Development launched with full scholarships for 10 students. The press release went out under Annalise's name, with the Jacks Foundation listed merely as a supporting partner. It was the first time he'd ever put millions into something without ensuring his name was prominently displayed. The look of surprised approval in Annalise's eyes made it worth every anonymous penny. Yet even this victory came with its own lesson in humility. When he'd tried to use the Academy's success as an opening to ask her to dinner, she'd simply smiled and said, "Doing good things to impress someone isn't the same as being good, Mr. Jacks, but it's a start." His next move had been pure impulse, something the great Calamity Jacks never did. He'd volunteered to teach a business management seminar for the Academy's students. The first session had been a disaster. These weren't board members or employees who hung on his every word. They were street-smart kids who challenged his assumptions and questioned his methods. "You're too theoretical," Annalise had advised after sitting in on his second failed attempt. "These kids need practical knowledge they can use tomorrow, not Harvard Business School case studies." So he'd adapted, drawing on his early days of rebuilding the Jacks' fortune to teach real-world business skills. To his surprise, he found himself looking forward to the weekly sessions. The students' raw enthusiasm reminded him of his own hungry years before success had calcified into routine. More surprisingly, he found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about his father's failures, his mother's abandonment, the nights he'd spent poring over business books while his peers partied. Annalise had walked in during one of these moments of vulnerability, and the look she'd given him had made his heart stutter in his chest. "You're different with them," she'd observed later, "more real." "They deserve honesty," he'd replied, then added without thinking, "So do you." The words had hung between them, heavy with implication. For a moment something had shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips. But then a client had arrived, and the moment had passed. That night, alone in his penthouse, Calamity faced an uncomfortable truth. He was falling in love with Annalise Oliver, and for the first time in his life, his money, power, and carefully cultivated image were completely useless. Chapter 4. Breaking Through. The autumn rain painted Birmingham's skyline in watercolor shades of grey, transforming the windows of Crown Beauty into streaming mirrors. Inside, Annalise stood at her station, watching droplets race down the glass while her last client of the day gathered her belongings. The salon had that peculiar twilight energy, the transition between the bustle of business hours and the contemplative quiet of closing time. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. After months of what her mother would call that rich man's foolishness, she developed a sixth sense for Calamity Jacks's presence. His expensive cologne, custom blended in Paris, she'd learned, always arrived a fraction of a second before he did. "We're closed, Mr. Jacks," she said, still watching the rain. "I know." His voice carried none of its usual corporate authority. Something in his tone made her turn. Calamity Jacks, terror of boardrooms, architect of hostile takeovers, Birmingham's most eligible billionaire, stood in her salon looking like a drowned cat. His bespoke suit was soaked through, dark hair plastered to his forehead, Italian leather shoes squeaking slightly on the marble floor. "Your driver sick today?" she asked, fighting back a smile. "I walked." From Jacks Industries, the towering skyscraper was 15 blocks away. "In this weather?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as genuine nervousness rather than his usual calculated charm. "I needed to think. Walking helps." "And what conclusion did this wet wandering bring you to?" She began her closing routine, more out of habit than necessity. The familiar motions of cleaning her tools and organizing her station helped maintain the professional barrier she'd worked so hard to keep in place. "I met with Sarah today, from the Academy." He moved closer, leaving damp footprints on the floor. "She's been offered an apprenticeship at Vogue's styling department in New York." Annalise's hands stilled on her scissors. Sarah, their first scholarship student, had shown extraordinary talent, but this opportunity was beyond their wildest hopes. "That's incredible. When did—" I had nothing to do with it, he interrupted, anticipating her assumption. She earned it entirely on her own merit. I wanted you to know that. The pride in his voice was genuine, touching something in Annalise that she'd been trying very hard to ignore. Over the past months, she'd watched him transform from a man who measured everything in dollars and cents to someone who could take genuine joy in others' success. Coffee. The word escaped before she could catch it. He blinked, water dripping from his eyelashes. What? You're soaked, Mr. Jacks. I have a French press in the back office, and you look like you could use something warm. She gestured to the staff area, a space she'd fiercely protected as off-limits to him, despite his technical ownership of the building. Calamity, he corrected softly. After all this time, you could at least call me Calamity. The staff room was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture that spoke of comfort over corporate aesthetics. Annalise's touch was evident in the potted plants and hand-knitted throws draped over chairs, items that had survived his renovation budget because she'd insisted that luxury didn't always mean new. She moved through the familiar motions of making coffee, aware of him taking in every detail of this previously forbidden territory. His eyes lingered on the wall of photos, staff birthdays, academy graduations, candid moments of laughter and celebration. Here, she handed him a towel from her locker. Before you catch pneumonia, and I have to explain to your board why their CEO is sneezing through merger negotiations. He accepted the towel with a small smile, running it over his hair. The action transformed him from polished businessman to something more human, more approachable. Water darkened the shoulders of his jacket, and without thinking, Annalise reached to help him remove it. Their fingers brushed, and the air in the small room suddenly felt charged with possibility. She stepped back quickly, busying herself with the coffee preparation. "The first time I saw you," he said quietly, "you were doing Mrs. Davidson's hair. Do you remember?" "I remember a very impatient man who wasn't used to waiting for anything." She measured coffee grounds carefully, focusing on the task rather than the intensity of his gaze. "You were so genuine with her, so present in that moment. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen anyone in my world be truly genuine about anything." The coffee maker burbled, filling the silence between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, but in this small room, time seemed to move differently. "Why did you really come here tonight?" She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "And don't tell me it was just about Sarah's apprenticeship." He set the towel down, running his fingers through his damp hair, that nervous gesture again. "I had a board meeting today. They want to expand Crown Beauty into a national chain. Premium locations, standardized service, maximum profit optimization. Isn't that what you want? Isn't that why you bought the salon in the first place? Is that what you think?" There was hurt in his voice, surprising them both. "After all this time, do you still believe this was just another acquisition for me?" The coffee maker beeped, making them both jump. Annalise turned to pour 2 cups, grateful for the momentary distraction. When she handed him his coffee, black, no sugar, she'd learned that detail somewhere along the way. Their fingers brushed again. "I think," she said carefully, "that you're not the same man who walked into my salon 6 months ago, but I also think you're still figuring out who this new version of you is." "And who do you think that is?" "Someone who walks 15 blocks in the rain to share good news about a student's success. Someone who teaches business classes to kids who challenge his every assumption. Someone who's learning that not everything of value can be bought or sold." He set his untouched coffee down, closing the distance between them with 2 steps. "Ask me again why I came here tonight." Her heart thundered in her chest, but she held her ground. "Why did you come here tonight, Calamity? Because I'm in love with you." The words tumbled out, unpolished and raw. Because every decision I've made for the past 6 months has been about finding reasons to be near you. Because you make me want to be better than I am, and it terrifies me, and I don't care." The confession hung in the air between them, as heavy as the storm clouds outside. Annalise felt the careful walls she'd built beginning to crumble. "You're not terrified," she whispered. "You're just not used to not being in control." "You're right." He was close enough now that she could see the droplets of rain still clinging to his shirt collar. "I'm not in control. Not of this, not of how I feel about you, not of anything when I'm near you. And for the first time in my life, I don't want to be." Chapter 5. A wedding to remember dawn broke over Calamity Castle like a painter's dream, casting rose-gold light across centuries of Gothic architecture and newly erected crystal pavilions. The morning mist clung to the perfectly manicured gardens, where thousands of white roses nodded their heads in the gentle breeze. Inside the castle's ancient walls, an army of staff moved with practiced precision, transforming the austere family seat into a fairy tale setting that would soon host Birmingham's wedding of the decade. In the East Wing's bridal suite, Annalise Oliver stood before a floor-length mirror, watching as her mother secured the last pearl button on her wedding gown. The dress was a masterpiece of fusion, traditional African wax print motifs reimagined in silk and lace by Paris's most exclusive atelier. Each pattern told a story: wisdom, love, strength, and new beginnings woven together in cream and gold. "Your father would be so proud," her mother whispered, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from the train, "though he probably wouldn't believe his little girl was marrying into all this." She gestured at the opulent room with its silk damask walls and crystal chandelier. Annalise touched the locket at her throat, her father's last gift before cancer took him. "He'd be more impressed that I kept the salon running than by any of this grandeur, Mama." "True." Her mother's smile held years of understanding. That man could spot authentic value a mile away, just like his daughter. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Mrs. Davidson, who had insisted on doing Annalise's hair herself. The elderly woman had become something of a surrogate grandmother during the whirlwind romance, dispensing wisdom and warmth in equal measure. "Well, don't you look like a queen?" Mrs. Davidson declared, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. "Though I suspect our Mr. Jacks would marry you if you showed up in your salon apron." The thought of calamity brought a flush to Annalise's cheeks. Their journey from reluctant business associates to this moment had been anything but conventional. Every step had challenged their assumptions about love, trust, and what truly mattered in life. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, Calamity Jacks paced his childhood bedroom like a caged lion. The room, once a sanctuary from his father's failures and his mother's departures, now felt too small to contain his nervous energy. "If you wear out that carpet, I'm not buying a new one," Mia's voice cut through his thoughts. His sister leaned against the doorframe, already dressed in her role as matron of honor, a position that had surprised everyone, especially Annalise. What if she changes her mind? The words escaped before he could stop them. What if she realizes that all of this? He gestured to the window where guests were already arriving in luxury cars. "Isn't what she wants." Mia crossed the room, straightening his bow tie with sisterly authority. "Little brother, that woman has seen you at your worst and your best. She's watched you transform from Birmingham's most eligible bachelor into someone worthy of real love. Trust me, she knows exactly what she wants." The memory of his proposal flooded back. Not the elaborate plan he'd originally conceived, but the quiet moment in the salon's back office where it had actually happened. He'd been helping her review applications for the next academy class, their heads bent together over student essays, when the certainty had struck him like lightning. "Marry me," he'd said, interrupting her analysis of a particularly promising candidate. She'd looked up, reading his face with that penetrating gaze that had first captured his attention. "Are you sure that's what you want? Not just another acquisition for the Jax empire?" "I want a lifetime of you challenging every decision I make," he'd replied. "I want to build something real with someone who sees me, not my bank account. I want you, Annalise Oliver, exactly as you are." She'd made him wait 5 full minutes before saying yes, later admitting she'd done it just to teach him patience. He'd never loved her more than in that moment. Now, adjusting his cufflinks, simple silver rather than his usual diamonds, a conscious choice, he tried to channel that certainty through his nerves. The castle's great hall had been transformed beyond recognition. Crystal chandeliers floated like constellations beneath the vaulted ceiling. The ancient stone walls wore trails of white orchids and roses, their perfume mixing with notes of frankincense and myrrh, a tribute to Annalise's heritage. Afternoon sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting the assembled guests in jewel tones. Birmingham's elite sat shoulder to shoulder with Annalise's salon staff and academy students. Sarah, now back from her successful apprenticeship in New York, had helped style the bridal party's hair. Mrs. Davidson held court in the front row, radiating approval as she compared notes with Annalise's mother. The music began. Not Wagner's traditional march, but a sophisticated blend of classical strings and West African kora, commissioned specially for the occasion. The assembled guests rose, turning expectantly toward the great doors. Calamity's heart stopped when he saw her. Annalise moved down the aisle like a dream made real, each step precise yet graceful. The dress caught light and shadow, traditional patterns shifting with her movement. But it was her face that transformed him. The quiet confidence, the gentle wisdom, and beneath it all, a love that had reformed his entire world. Their vows were personal, honest, and entirely their own. Calamity's voice cracked as he promised not just fidelity and devotion, but a lifetime of growing, learning, and becoming better together. Annalise's response wove humor with profound truth, promising to challenge him when he needed it and support him always. "The rings you exchange," the officiant intoned, "are circles without end, symbolizing love that knows no boundaries and truth that knows no deception." The simple bands, his choice, not his usual extravagance, slid home like destiny. Chapter 6. Domestic Bliss. The first rays of morning sun painted Calamity Castle's master suite in shades of amber and gold, casting warm light across the sleeping forms of Birmingham's most talked-about couple. Annalise stirred first, her natural early riser habits unchanged by marriage to a man who considered 9 a.m. the crack of dawn. She watched her husband's peaceful face, marveling at how different he looked in sleep. All the sharp edges of the business titan softened into something almost boyish. Their first 6 months of marriage had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. The ancient halls of Calamity Castle, once echoing with the ghosts of failed marriages and broken promises, now rang with laughter and the warm sense of Annalise's cooking experiments. She'd insisted on learning to use the massive kitchen herself, much to the initial confusion of the household staff. "Mrs. Jax," the head chef had protested during her first attempt at making her grandmother's jollof rice, "this really isn't necessary." "First," she'd interrupted with a smile, "it's still Annalise. And second, some things need to be made with love, not just skill." By the end of that evening, she'd not only mastered the dish, but had the entire kitchen staff swapping family recipes and stories. Calamity found himself drawn to these informal gatherings, initially watching from the doorway as his wife broke down centuries of rigid household hierarchy with nothing more than genuine warmth and shared meals. Gradually, he joined them, discovering a kind of family he'd never known existed. Now, Watching him sleep, Annalise reflected on the changes she'd seen in him. The man who once measured everything in profit margins had learned to value the immeasurable. Just yesterday, he'd delayed a board meeting to attend the graduation ceremony of their latest academy class. "The Thompson merger can wait," he'd said, straightening his tie in the mirror. "These kids only graduate once." She'd caught him later, in a quiet moment, teaching one of the graduates how to tie a proper Windsor knot. The boy's father wasn't in the picture, and Calamity had stepped in with such natural grace that it brought tears to her eyes. Their morning routine had developed its own rhythm. She'd rise first, spending quiet moments in the castle's renovated conservatory, where she'd created a small jungle of tropical plants. He'd find her there an hour later, bringing coffee made exactly the way she liked it, a skill he'd insisted on learning, despite the house staff's protests. "Some things," he'd said, echoing her own words, "need to be done with love." The household staff had adapted to their new mistress with varying degrees of surprise and delight. Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Jack's wives, found herself particularly transformed by Annalise's influence. "In all my years," she confided to her sister on the phone, "I've never seen this house so alive. She's brought light into places that haven't seen it in decades." Indeed, Annalise had instituted changes that would have scandalized previous generations. The formal dining room, once used only for business dinners and social obligations, now hosted weekly family-style meals where staff and employers ate together. The garden's precious roses now shared space with practical herbs and vegetables. Even the austere portrait gallery had been brightened with photographs of happy moments, academy graduations, staff birthdays, and candid shots of the couple themselves. But perhaps the most profound change was in Calamity himself. The man who once ruled his empire through fear and intimidation had learned the power of genuine connection. His employees noted the shift with a mixture of relief and amazement. During a particularly tense merger negotiation, he'd surprised everyone by calling a break, just as tensions peaked. "Let's remember we're all human here," he'd said, a phrase that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "Sometimes the best deals happen over coffee and conversation." Their professional lives had intertwined in unexpected ways. The Crown Beauty Academy had expanded, not through corporate acquisition, but through community partnerships. Annalise's vision of accessible education, combined with Calamity's business acumen, had created something truly unique. One morning, about 4 months into their marriage, Annalise had found him in his home office, surrounded by student applications. "What are you doing?" she'd asked, noting the unusual sight of Birmingham's most powerful CEO reading handwritten essays at 6 a.m. "This one," he'd said, holding up a particularly dog-eared application. "She reminds me of you. Same fire, same determination to prove everyone wrong." His voice had softened. "She deserves a chance, just like all these kids do." That moment had crystallized something for Annalise, the realization that their marriage wasn't just about them. It was about the ripple effects their union could create, the lives they could touch, the changes they could inspire. Their intimate moments were made sweeter by the understanding that they were building something larger than themselves. Late-night conversations ranged from academy expansion plans to dreams of family, from business strategies to childhood memories. "I never thought I could have this," he'd confessed one night, tracing patterns on her skin as they lay in the dark. "I spent so long believing that power was the only thing worth having. You've shown me what real wealth looks like." The castle itself seemed to respond to their happiness. Rooms that had been sealed for generations were opened and renewed. The library, once a shrine to leather-bound business volumes, now included everything from fashion magazines to children's books. The latter, an addition that raised eyebrows but went uncommented on. Chapter 7. The hurricane named Mia. The morning Mia Flora returned to Calamity Castle dawned with deceptive tranquility. Autumn sunlight gilded the ancient stones, while staff moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what they'd been told was a special visitor. Only Mrs. Hughes, who had served the Jacks family through 3 generations of drama, recognized the signs of an approaching storm. "Something's different about the preparations," Annalise observed over breakfast, watching the unusual flurry of activity in the courtyard. The staff moved with an intensity she'd never seen before, their usual easy camaraderie replaced by tense precision. "What aren't you telling me, my love?" Calamity's hand tightened imperceptibly around his coffee cup. "Mia's coming home." The simple statement carried the weight of history, prophecy, and warning all at once. In their 6 months of marriage, his sister's name had surfaced only in carefully measured doses, usually accompanied by that slight tension in his jaw that Annalise had learned to read like a barometer of emotional weather. "Your sister," Annalise said carefully. "The one who's been in Australia. I thought she wasn't due back until—" "She wasn't." He set down his cup with deliberate control. "Something's wrong. Mia doesn't change plans unless she's plotting something or running from something, usually both." The staff's anxiety suddenly made sense. They'd all been here for the previous Mia storms, the drama of her whirlwind marriage to Australian mining magnate James Flora, the spectacular fights that preceded her departure, the way she could reduce seasoned housekeepers to tears with a single raised eyebrow. "Should I change?" Annalise glanced down at her simple dress, elegant but casual, perfect for a morning of academy administrative work. "Perhaps something more formal?" "No." Calamity's voice carried an edge of steel. "This is your home now. You don't change for anyone, not even Mia." By noon, the castle hummed with anticipation. Fresh flowers filled every room, white lilies, Mia's favorite, their heady scent almost overwhelming. Staff had polished every surface to mirror brightness, and Mrs. Hughes had personally inspected each corner for imaginary dust. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival. Annalise watched from the library window as a convoy of black SUVs swept into the courtyard. The vehicles formed a precise semicircle, choreographed with military precision. From the central car emerged a vision in Chanel and perfectly controlled chaos. Mia Flora née Jacks moved like a force of nature, her designer heels striking the gravel with the authority of a general surveying a battlefield. Behind her, a parade of assistants and handlers scurried with luggage and documents. "Darling brother," Mia's voice carried across the courtyard, rich with warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't just stand there looking shocked. Come help your poor sister up these treacherous steps." Calamity moved forward automatically, years of conditioning overriding his new independence. Annalise watched their embrace, Mia's perfectly manicured hands gripping her brother's shoulders, her air kisses precisely aimed to avoid smudging her lipstick. Then Mia's gaze swept the courtyard and locked onto Annalise through the library window. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "And who," Mia's voice carried clearly through the autumn air, "is that charming creature watching us? Don't tell me you've started allowing the help to use the family quarters, darling." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Calamity's spine stiffened, but before he could speak, Annalise was moving. Years of dealing with difficult clients had taught her the value of taking control of uncomfortable situations. She emerged from the castle with the grace that had first captured Calamity's heart, extending her hand to her sister-in-law. "Annalise Oliver Jacks," she said, her voice carrying just the right blend of warmth and authority. "Welcome home, sister." Mia's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose a fraction. "Sister?" She turned to Calamity, her expression a masterpiece of calculated surprise. "Darling, you've been keeping secrets. When did this charming development occur?" 6 months ago, Calamity replied, moving to stand beside his wife. The invitation must have been lost in the mail. Obviously, Mia's smile was a weapon honed by years of social warfare. How progressive of you, darling, though I must say, if you were going to marry the help, you could have at least chosen someone from the accounting department. More practical, you know. The barb hung in the air like poison. Annalise felt Calamity tense beside her, ready to defend her honor, but she squeezed his hand gently. This was her battle to fight. Actually, Annalise replied with a smile that could cut glass, I own my own business. Well, co-own now, since your brother insisted on becoming my partner in every sense of the word. But I'm sure you know all about successful partnerships, don't you, Mia? How is James, by the way? Still in Australia? The hit landed. Something flickered behind Mia's perfect mask, pain, rage, or perhaps both. But before she could respond, a new figure emerged from the second SUV. Mia, darling, where should I have them put the Hermes luggage? The leather's too delicate for these common handlers to... The speaker stopped short upon seeing the tableau on the steps. Frankie Chen, Annalise would later learn, had been Mia's companion and confidant since their boarding school days. Now she stood frozen, designer sunglasses hiding her expression but not her obvious discomfort. Ah, Frankie, Mia recovered smoothly. Come meet my brother's new wife. Isn't it wonderful? Our little family is growing in the most unexpected ways. The emphasis on unexpected carried enough weight to sink a battleship. But Annalise had spent years building her own business in a world that hadn't expected her to succeed. She knew how to weather storms. Mrs. Hughes, she called, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and grace, please show Ms. Flora and Ms. Chen to their rooms. I'm sure they'd like to rest after their long journey. We can continue getting to know each other over dinner. Mrs. Hughes moved forward with visible relief, grateful for the voice of reason. But as the housekeeper led Mia and Frankie into the castle, Mia paused at the door. Oh, and darling. She turned back, her smile now arctic. Do try to have the chef prepare something civilized for dinner. I've had quite enough exotic experiences in Australia. The door closed behind her with the finality of a prison gate. Chapter 8. Silent Warfare. The art of warfare, as Sun Tzu wrote, is winning without fighting. In the gilded halls of Calamity Castle, two women engaged in a battle where every smile concealed a strategy and every courtesy masked a calculated move. Mia Flora had initiated hostilities with surgical precision, but she quickly discovered that Annalise Oliver Jacks was no ordinary opponent. The first skirmish began at breakfast, 3 days after Mia's arrival. The morning sun streamed through leaded windows, illuminating the formal dining room where generations of Jack's women had presided over carefully orchestrated meals. Mia swept in, Frankie trailing like a designer-clad shadow, to find the room transformed. Gone was the formal table setting for two that had been the castle's tradition. Instead, a buffet-style spread covered the sideboard, while staff members chatted comfortably over coffee and pastries. At the center of it all sat Annalise, reviewing academy applications while Mrs. Hughes's granddaughter practiced French braiding on her hair. What? Mia's voice could have frozen flame. Is the meaning of this casual arrangement? Annalise looked up with perfect serenity. Good morning, sister. We've found that sharing breakfast builds stronger relationships among the household. Please join us. Cook made your favorite brioche. It was a masterful move. Mia couldn't object without appearing petty, yet the very informality undermined her carefully cultivated authority. She settled for a tight smile and a pointed whisper to Frankie about standards slipping dreadfully. The battle lines were drawn. Mia's first counterstrike came through the household staff. Subtle suggestions about proper procedures and traditional expectations began circulating. The same servants who had blossomed under Annalise's warmth found themselves caught between competing loyalties. But Annalise had spent years building her business through genuine connections. When Mrs. Hughes found herself torn between Mia's demands for formal dinner service and Annalise's more relaxed style, the new Mrs. Jacks simply invited the housekeeper to tea. "Tell me about when you first came to the castle," Annalise said, pouring tea with the grace that had first captured Calamity's heart. "What made you stay all these years?" The afternoons stretched into evening as Mrs. Hughes shared stories of past triumphs and tragedies, of the young Mia who had tried so hard to be perfect after their mother left, of the weight of tradition that both protected and imprisoned the Jacks family. By evening's end, Annalise had gained not just an ally, but a deeper understanding of her adversary. Mia's perfectionism wasn't just snobbery, it was armor, forged in the fires of childhood abandonment. The next battleground was the charity gala season. Mia announced her plans to chair the annual Jacks Foundation Winter Ball, traditionally the social event of the season. It was a power play meant to remind everyone of her position as the senior Jacks woman. Annalise's response was unexpected. Instead of competing directly, she launched a series of intimate fundraising dinners for the academy. Each event featured students showcasing their skills, transforming traditional society gatherings into celebrations of talent and possibility. When Mia's carefully orchestrated winter ball struggled to sell tables, while Annalise's academy dinners had a waiting list, the elder Jack's sister was forced to adapt. She arrived at one of the academy events, ostensibly to support her brother's charitable works. "Fascinating approach," Mia commented, watching a student demonstrate advanced styling techniques, "though perhaps a bit hands-on for our usual donors." Annalise smiled warmly. "That's exactly why they love it. Real connection is rare in their world. You of all people must understand that, having lived so long in Australia's social circles." The reference to Mia's self-imposed exile struck home. For a moment, real emotion cracked through her perfect facade. "Sometimes distance is necessary for perspective. And sometimes," Annalise replied softly, "it's just running away." The exchange marked a shift in their conflict. Beneath the social machinations and power plays, both women recognized something in each other, a strength forged through adversity, a determination to protect what they valued. Their warfare evolved into something more complex than simple antagonism. When Mia attempted to rearrange the household staff schedules, Annalise didn't just counter the move. She invited Mia to help review the academy's administrative systems. "Your organizational skills are legendary," Annalise said sincerely. "We could use your expertise." It was an olive branch wrapped in respect, and for a moment Mia seemed tempted, but Frankie's presence at her elbow seemed to stiffen her resolve. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your project," Mia replied, but her tone lacked its usual ice. The household staff watched this elaborate dance with mixed emotions. Some sided firmly with tradition and Mia's familiar authority. Others had embraced Annalise's warmer, more inclusive approach, but all recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Calamity Castle's long history. Calamity himself seemed torn between admiration for his wife's handling of the situation and concern for his sister's underlying pain. He found Annalise in their private sitting room one evening, reviewing the day's subtle victories and defeats. "You're different from anyone she's ever encountered," he said, watching her brush out her hair. "She doesn't know whether to hate you or learn from you." Annalise set down her brush, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "She's fighting so hard to hold on to something that's already changed. I understand that fear." "Fear?" Calamity looked startled. "Mia's never been afraid of anything. Everyone's afraid of something, my love. Your sister is afraid of losing control, just like you were. The difference is you learn to let go. She's still holding on with both hands." The truth of this observation would become clear sooner than anyone expected. As autumn deepened into winter, the tension in Calamity Castle built toward an inevitable breaking point. Both women had proven themselves formidable opponents in this silent warfare, but neither recognized that they were playing into the hands of a third party. Frankie Chen watched it all with calculating eyes, feeding Mia's insecurities while presenting herself as the perfect ally. Her own agenda remained hidden, wrapped in designer clothes and practiced devotion. Chapter 9. The Setup. In the private sanctuary of her castle suite, Mia Flora examined the photographs spread across her antique writing desk. Each image told a story, or rather suggested one. Annalise, at her favorite restaurant, smiling warmly at a handsome black man. The same man appearing coincidentally at various locations throughout her weekly routine. A seemingly intimate conversation over coffee, each picture carefully staged, each moment orchestrated with the precision of a master conductor. The photographer did excellent work, Frankie observed, arranging the images in sequence. The angles suggest intimacy without being explicit, perfect for planting seeds of doubt. Mia's perfectly manicured nails traced the edge of a particularly damning photo. Marcus was the perfect choice, she mused. Successful, attractive, and most importantly, willing to play his part without asking too many questions. The fact that he resembles her type, our dear brother, makes it all the more believable. The plan had taken weeks to execute. First, the careful observation of Annalise's routines, the weekly lunch at Le Petit Jardin every Friday, her morning coffee runs, the predictable patterns of a woman who had nothing to hide, until now. Marcus Davidson had been selected with surgical precision. A rising star in Birmingham's architectural scene, his firm had recently won several prestigious contracts. More importantly, he owed his success to a timely investment from one of Mia's Australian connections. When she called in the favor, he couldn't refuse. Just a few casual encounters, Mia had assured him. Nothing inappropriate. We're simply testing someone's loyalty to the family. What Marcus didn't know was that he was just a pawn in a larger game. Each chance meeting had been choreographed, each photograph composed to tell exactly the story Mia needed to tell. But the true masterstroke had been Frankie's idea. The gift. A small package, supposedly from Calamity, delivered by Marcus at just the right moment. Annalise's natural warmth and gratitude would do the rest, creating pictures that could destroy everything she'd built. The timing has to be perfect, Frankie reminded her friend, sorting through surveillance reports from their hired investigators. Calamity needs to be stressed, vulnerable. The Thompson merger is proceeding exactly as planned, Mia interrupted with a cold smile. My little brother's so focused on proving himself with this deal, he's barely noticed the tension in his own home. Men can be so predictably blind. The Thompson merger had been another piece of their elaborate chess game. Through careful manipulation of her Australian business connections, Mia had ensured that what should have been a straightforward acquisition became increasingly complex. Each new complication pushed Calamity further into his old patterns, longer hours, shorter temper, the gradual retreat into the corporate warrior he'd been before Annalise. And the staff, Frankie inquired, making notes in her ever-present tablet. Divided, as expected. Mrs. Hughes remains loyal to our new mistress of the castle, but enough of the others remember their proper place. When the moment comes, they'll conveniently forget any explanations Annalise tries to offer. The scheme's brilliance lay in its simplicity. No elaborate conspiracies, no over-the-top drama, just carefully planted doubts and strategically timed revelations. Like poison in a teacup, it would destroy from within. There's still the risk, Frankie ventured carefully, that Calamity might actually listen to her explanations. Their connection seems genuine. A shadow passed over Mia's perfect features. For a moment the mask slipped, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "Love," she said bitterly, "is always genuine until it isn't. I learned that lesson in Australia. It's time my brother learned it too." The mention of Australia brought a familiar tension to the room. Mia's hasty return, the absence of her husband James, the whispered rumours in Melbourne's social circles, all pieces of a story she hadn't shared even with Frankie. But that pain, that humiliation, had crystallized into purpose. If her own marriage could shatter despite years of careful planning and social perfection, then surely this unsuitable union could be dismantled with the right pressure applied at the right points. The next phase required perfect timing. The photographs would be revealed gradually, a whispered comment here, a concerned staff member there. The doubt would grow like a cancer, invisible until it was too late to treat. And what about after? Frankie's question hung in the air. Once she's gone. After, Mia replied, straightening the photographs with mathematical precision, we rebuild. The proper order will be restored. Calamity will return to being the man he was meant to be, not this softened version she's created. The Jack's name will mean something again. But even as she spoke, something flickered in her eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a truth she couldn't quite acknowledge. In destroying Annalise's marriage, would she also destroy the best version of her brother she'd ever seen? The thought was dismissed as quickly as it formed. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the very foundation of her world was at stake. Outside the castle windows, autumn winds stripped leaves from ancient trees, nature's own demonstration of necessary endings. Soon, very soon, another proud beauty would fall from grace. Chapter 10. The Fall. The day everything changed began like any other at Calamity Castle. Autumn sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold, while fallen leaves danced across the manicured lawns. Inside, Annalise hummed softly as she prepared for a special evening with her husband. The pregnancy test, hidden in her bathroom cabinet, held a secret she could barely wait to share. 6 months of marriage had taught her to read the subtle signs of Calamity's moods, in the way he came home, the rhythm of his footsteps on the marble floors, the particular tension in his shoulders after a long day. But nothing could have prepared her for the sound that echoed through the castle that evening, the sharp crack of the front door slamming with enough force to rattle the ancestral portraits. "Where is she?" Calamity's voice carried up the grand staircase. Stripped of its usual controlled power, raw with something she'd never heard before, betrayal. In their bedroom, Annalise felt her heart stutter. The joy she'd been nurturing all day crystallized into fear, not for herself, but for the dream they'd built together. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror of her own childhood home, the day her mother discovered her father's supposed infidelity. A misunderstanding that had nearly torn their family apart before the truth emerged. Calamity burst into their room like a storm made flesh. His tie was askew, his usually perfect hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They held none of the warmth she'd come to know, only a cold fury that transformed him back into the man she'd first met, the one who measured everything in profit and loss. Explain these. Photographs scattered across their bed like fallen leaves, each one a carefully crafted moment taken out of context. Her weekly lunch at Le Petit Jardin, captured from angles that suggested intimacy rather than the chance encounters they'd been. The gift she'd accepted, believing it was from her husband, now transformed into evidence of deception. "It's not what you think," she began, the words feeling hollow even as they left her lips. "How do you explain innocence when guilt has already been assumed? That man, he said he was sent by you." "By me?" His laugh held no humor. "I've been buried in the Thompson merger for weeks. When would I have time to arrange secret meetings with your lover?" The word lover struck like a physical blow. "Calamity, please listen." "To what? More lies? More explanations about how this isn't what it looks like?" He picked up one of the photos, his knuckles white with tension. "You know what the worst part is? Mia tried to warn me. She said I was blinded but I defended you. I thought you were different." The mention of Mia's name sparked a realization in Annalise's mind, pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. The coincidental meetings, the perfectly timed photographs, the mysterious gift, all orchestrated with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate perceptions. "Your sister," Annalise said quietly, understanding flooding her system. "This is her doing. Think about it, Calamity. Why would these photos exist unless someone arranged for them to be taken?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of trust they'd built together. But then his gaze fell on the final photograph, the one showing her accepting the gift with a warm smile, and the walls slammed back into place. "Get out!" The words fell between them, like stones into still water. "What? Get out of my house. Get out of my life." Each word was precisely enunciated, cut with the same sharp edge he used in hostile takeovers. "Whatever this was between us, it's over." "Calamity, please!" She reached for him, but he recoiled as if her touch might burn. "I said, get out!" The roar made her stumble backward, colliding with their dressing table. The small velvet box containing her pregnancy test clattered to the floor, unnoticed in the storm of emotion. In that moment, standing in the room they'd shared, surrounded by evidence of their life together, Annalise felt something break inside her. Not her heart, that would come later, but her faith in the power of love to overcome prejudice and pride. The next few minutes passed in a blur of motion and sharp words. Staff appeared in doorways, their faces masks of practiced neutrality as she gathered essential belongings. Mrs. Hughes tried to intervene, but one look from Calamity silenced even her lifelong loyalty. Mia appeared as Annalise reached the grand staircase, Frankie a silent shadow behind her. "Oh dear," her voice dripped false concern. "Has something happened? Shall I call someone?" Annalise paused on the stairs, looking up at the woman who had orchestrated her downfall. In that moment, she saw past Mia's perfect facade to the wounded creature beneath, someone so broken by her own pain that she could only find satisfaction in destroying others' happiness. "You've won," Annalise said quietly. "I hope it brings you the peace you're looking for." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. For a fraction of a second, Mia's mask slipped, revealing something that might have been regret. But then Frankie touched her arm, and the moment passed. Outside, the autumn wind caught at Annalise's clothes as she walked away from Calamity Castle. Each step felt like walking through deep water, weighted by the dreams and hopes she was leaving behind. The child growing beneath her heart, their child, would have to remain her secret for now. Chapter 11. Truth and Consequences. The truth has a way of surfacing like air bubbles in still water, rising inexorably toward the light. For Calamity Jacks, it began with a velvet box discovered beneath their bed during the mansion's weekly cleaning, a forgotten pregnancy test that would shatter his carefully reconstructed world. Mrs. Hughes stood in his study, her aged hands trembling as she placed the box on his mahogany desk. The elderly housekeeper had served 3 generations of Jack's family drama, but never had she seen such devastation as in the month since Annalise's departure. "Sir," her voice carried the weight of decades of loyalty, "there's something you need to see." The test's positive indicator stared up at him like an accusation, 2 pink lines that rewrote everything he thought he knew. The date on the box, the same day he'd thrown his wife out of their home, burned into his consciousness. "There's more," Mrs. Hughes continued, her professional reserve cracking. "The staff. We've been afraid to speak, but we can't carry this burden any longer." The floodgates opened. One by one, household staff came forward with pieces of a puzzle they'd been too frightened to share. The mysterious man from the photographs had been seen receiving instructions from Frankie. Strange phone calls from Mia to Australian numbers planning something in hushed tones. "She threatened our jobs," the young gardener admitted, twisting his cap in nervous hands. "Said anyone who spoke up would never work in Birmingham again." Calamity sat motionless behind his desk, each revelation hitting like a physical blow. The corporate titan, who prided himself on seeing through every business deception, had been blind to the manipulation happening in his own home. His first instinct was denial. Mia was his sister, his protector since childhood. She couldn't have orchestrated something so cruel. But as he reviewed security footage, tracked phone records and interviewed staff, the truth became undeniable. The confrontation with Mia happened in the castle's library, where generations of Jack's family secrets had been buried in leather-bound volumes. Why? The single word carried the weight of betrayal. Mia stood by the window, her perfect posture a shield against accusation. "Because she wasn't one of us. Because she was changing you into someone I didn't recognize. Because you couldn't stand seeing me happy." The words struck like lightning, illuminating dark corners of their relationship he'd never examined. "Happy?" Mia turned, her facade cracking. "You think love brings happiness? Where was love when our mother left? When father's wives used him and left? When James—" She stopped abruptly, but the pain in her voice revealed wounds deeper than Calamity had imagined. "What happened in Australia, Mia?" The question broke something in his sister. The story poured out. Her husband's affairs, the public humiliation, the carefully hidden divorce. She'd fled back to Birmingham, determined to protect her brother from what she saw as inevitable betrayal. "I was saving you," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her ears. "Saving me." Calamity's laugh held no humor. "You destroyed the one genuine thing in my life, and now—" He placed the pregnancy test on the table between them. "Now I may have lost not just my wife, but my child." The color drained from Mia's face as she stared at the evidence of what she'd really destroyed. In her determination to protect her brother from imagined pain, she'd caused devastation beyond measure. Frankie chose that moment to appear, her calculated entrance failing as she read the room's tension. "Mia, darling, perhaps we should—" "Get out." Calamity's voice carried the same authority that had built his empire. "Both of you, get out of my house." "Brother, please, I said get out." The roar echoed through ancestral halls. "You've done enough damage with your schemes and manipulation. I want you gone by nightfall." As his sister fled the library, Calamity turned to the window, watching autumn rain paint patterns on ancient glass. Somewhere out there, Annalise was carrying their child, believing herself betrayed and abandoned. The weight of his failure pressed down like a physical force. That evening he sat in their bedroom, her side still untouched since her departure, and began making calls. Private investigators were hired, social media accounts scoured, every possible contact traced. But Annalise had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The academy students proved to be his first real lead. Sarah, now successful in New York, maintained contact with her mentor. But when reached, she became a wall of protective silence. "With all due respect, Mr. Jacks," her voice held steel beneath its professional polish, "you lost the right to know anything about her the day you chose pride over trust." Chapter 12. The Search. The Miami sun beat down mercilessly on Calamity Jacks's designer suit as he stood before the modest townhouse in Coral Gables. Gone was the commanding presence that had once dominated Birmingham's business world, replaced by a man humbled by his own mistakes. His private investigators had finally traced Annalise to this quiet neighborhood, where bougainvillea spilled over garden walls and children's laughter echoed from nearby playgrounds. The journey here had been more than just a physical search. For 12 months, he'd followed every lead, exhausted every resource, and in the process, discovered parts of himself he never knew existed. The ultrasound photo in his pocket, worn soft at the edges from constant handling, had become both his talisman and his torment. Each step up the path felt like walking through deep water, weighted by guilt and hope in equal measure. The modest home, with its cheerful yellow paint and carefully tended garden, spoke of Annalise's touch. She had always understood that true beauty lay in genuine care rather than expensive displays. When Grace Oliver opened the door, the years of pain and protective anger in her eyes struck harder than any business setback ever had. She stood like a sentinel, guarding not just a home, but the shattered pieces of her daughter's heart that she'd helped piece back together. "Mrs. Oliver," his voice carried none of its old authority, "I know I have no right to be here, but—" "No right?" She cut him off with quiet fury. "You threw my pregnant daughter out of your home without even letting her explain. You chose your sister's lies over her truth, and now, after a year of silence, you think you can just appear on my doorstep." The weight of his failures pressed down like a physical force. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words still strange on his tongue. "More wrong than I've ever been about anything in my life. But I've spent every day since then searching for her, trying to find a way to make this right." Movement behind Grace caught his attention. Children playing in the living room. His heart stopped as he caught glimpses of familiar features. His mother's eyes, Annalise's smile, perfect combinations of their shared DNA multiplied by 4. The revelation of quadruplets staggered him. 4 children, 4 perfect miracles he'd nearly lost through his own blind pride. The magnitude of what he'd almost thrown away threatened to bring him to his knees. Grace's refusal to let him see them properly was gentle but absolute. "That's not my decision to make," she said, her voice softening slightly at his visible pain. "These children are protected by love. The same love you once discarded so easily." The door closed with terrible finality, but something had shifted in Calamity's world. The man who had built an empire through hostile takeovers and strategic manipulation found himself learning the hardest lesson of all. True power lay in patience and humility. He rented a small apartment nearby, trading his Birmingham mansion for a modest 2-bedroom with a view of the children's route to daycare. Each morning, he watched from a respectful distance as Grace shepherded 4 small miracles through their daily routine. Slowly, he began to learn their personalities. The eldest by 2 minutes, a boy with his determination and Annalise's grace, always led the way. His sister, next in line, had inherited his mother's artistic soul, stopping to examine every flower and butterfly. The third, another boy, showed Annalise's gift for peacemaking, mediating tiny disputes with gentle touches. And the youngest, a girl with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of their combined ancestries, danced through life to music only she could hear. Letters piled up on Grace's doorstep, not demands or explanations, but stories. He wrote about their family history, both the triumphs and the failures, about his own childhood wounds that had led him to trust fear over love, about the person he was trying to become, someone worthy of being their father. Most came back unopened, but still, he wrote, the great Calamity Jacks, terror of boardrooms and architect of corporate empires, found himself learning to express emotions he'd spent a lifetime denying. His empire ran on autopilot as he devoted himself to this vigil. The board of directors grumbled about his absence, but for the first time in his life, profit margins seemed insignificant compared to the weight of 4 small hearts he'd never held. The breakthrough came through Mrs. Davidson, who appeared at his apartment one morning like a messenger from his past life. Her no-nonsense attitude cut through his fog of passive waiting. "Enough haunting the neighborhood like some designer-suited ghost," she declared, settling onto his modest couch like it was a throne. "If you want to prove you've changed, show it through action, not just presence." Under her guidance, Calamity began to truly understand what rebuilding trust meant. He established the Tomorrow's Promise Foundation, funding early childhood education programs throughout Miami. He worked with local community centers, creating opportunities for underprivileged youth. Each project was conducted quietly, without the Jack's name attached. The local community slowly began to know him not as the billionaire from Birmingham, but as the quiet man who funded art supplies for the community center, who paid medical bills for struggling families, who sat with elderly residents and listened to their stories. Weeks turned into months as he learned the rhythm of the neighborhood. The Cuban coffee shop owner who made the best cafecito in Miami, the retired teacher who ran the after-school program, the single mothers working multiple jobs to give their children opportunities. Through it all, he watched his children grow from a distance. He was there, unseen, for first steps and first words, for skinned knees and triumph. Each milestone was a gift and a punishment, the joy of witnessing their growth tempered by the knowledge that he'd nearly lost this chance forever. Chapter 13. The reunion time stops in moments of profound change. For Calamity Jacks, kneeling on the floor of Grace Oliver's living room, surrounded by his children for the first time, each heartbeat seemed to stretch into eternity. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch his youngest daughter's curls, so like her mother's. "Daddy." The word, spoken in a tiny voice filled with curiosity rather than recognition, shattered something inside him. Tears he'd held back for months fell freely as four pairs of eyes, his eyes, Annalise's eyes, perfect combinations of their love, studied him with innocent wonder. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your daddy." The oldest boy, already showing signs of his father's protective nature, stepped forward. "Grandma told us about you. She said you were lost but trying to find your way back home." She was right. Calamity looked up at Grace, seeing approval slowly replacing caution in her expression. "I was very lost, but your mother, she was always my true north. I just forgot how to read the compass for a while." The children gathered closer, drawn by the raw emotion in his voice. The artistic one touched his tie with delicate fingers. "You dress like the princes in our storybooks," she observed solemnly. A laugh escaped him, half sob and half joy. "I used to think fine clothes made the man," he admitted. "Your mother taught me it's what's in your heart that matters." The peacemaker of the group, sensitive to emotional undercurrents, placed a small hand on his cheek. "Don't cry, Daddy. Mommy says tears water the garden of new beginnings." The words, so clearly Annalise's wisdom passed through a child's understanding, broke him completely. He gathered them close, breathing in the miracle of their existence, these four perfect proofs that love could create something greater than pride or power or position. And then he felt it. That familiar presence, the shift in the air that had always announced her arrival. Looking up through tear-blurred eyes, he saw her. Annalise stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her heart, watching the scene unfold. The year had changed her. There was a new strength in her bearing, a hard-won wisdom in her eyes. But her beauty, the inner light that had first captured his heart, burned brighter than ever. Annalise. Her name emerged as a prayer. She moved into the room with that grace that had always made him think of sunlight on water. "Mother," she said softly, "would you take the children to get ice cream?" Grace understood immediately, gathering the little ones with practiced efficiency. "Come along, my treasures." Let's give your parents time to remember who they are together." When the door closed behind them, the silence stretched between Calamity and Annalise like a living thing. He rose slowly, afraid any sudden movement might shatter this moment. "You've been here," she said finally. "All these months. The community center programs, the medical fund for Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, the art supplies for the school. I had to prove I could be the man you always saw in me," he replied. "Not through grand gestures or power plays, but through real change, the kind that matters." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the tears trembling on her lashes. "Do you know what hurt the most? Not the accusations, not even the lack of trust. It was watching you become someone I didn't recognize, that cold, hard man from before." "I lost myself," he admitted, voice raw with truth. "Lost the person you helped me become. But finding you, finding our children, it's helped me find myself again, the self-worth being." Her hand rose, hesitated, then touched his cheek where their son's tears had left trails. "You've changed. For the better, I hope." He covered her hand with his own, cherishing this first contact. "Annalise, I know I don't deserve forgiveness." "Shh." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "Sometimes life isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we choose to give. You chose to change, to grow, to prove yourself through actions rather than words. Choose me again," he whispered against her fingers. "Choose us. I promise you'll never have to doubt my heart again." Instead of answering, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a familiar velvet box. The pregnancy test she'd never had the chance to show him that fateful day. "I was so excited to tell you," she said softly. "I had it all planned. Dinner, candles, the perfect moment to share our miracle. Then I let fear and pride destroy everything." He took the box with trembling hands. "But it wasn't one miracle, was it? It was 4 perfect miracles that I almost lost through my own blindness." She moved closer until he could feel the warmth of her body, the rhythm of her breathing. "They know you, you know. Every gift you've secretly arranged, every time you've watched from a distance, they've felt your love growing like a garden in spring." Chapter 14. New Beginnings. Spring painted Calamity Castle in shades of rebirth as the moving trucks wound their way up the long drive. Annalise stood in the doorway, watching their 4 children race across lawns now dotted with play equipment rather than formal gardens. The ancient walls that had once echoed with betrayal and pain now rang with laughter and the sound of small feet. Having second thoughts? Calamity's arms slipped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched their family's homecoming. "No," she smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "Just remembering how far we've come. Sometimes the longest journey leads right back home, but we return as different people." The castle had transformed during their year apart. Gone were the austere, formal rooms and rigid traditions. Instead, children's artwork brightened ancient walls, and family photos shared space with ancestral portraits. The Great Hall, once a showcase of power and privilege, now hosted weekly community gatherings where their academy students mingled with Birmingham's elite as equals. "Mommy! Daddy!" their youngest daughter called from the garden. "Look what we found." She held up a nest that had fallen from one of the old oak trees, its tiny inhabitants chirping desperately. Together, they helped the children create a safe space for the baby birds, teaching them about care and second chances. The symbolism wasn't lost on either parent. Just like us, their oldest son observed with childhood wisdom, they needed help finding their way back home. Later that evening, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Calamity and Annalise stood in their private garden, the same spot where they'd once shared their first dance as husband and wife. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her to a newly installed fountain. The water flowed over crystal sheets, catching moonlight like diamonds. But it was the inscription at the base that caught her breath. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I had it installed as a reminder, Calamity explained, of the lessons we learned the hard way. Annalise traced the letters with gentle fingers. Speaking of lessons, Mia called today. He tensed slightly, but she squeezed his hand reassuringly. She's doing well in Australia. The therapy is helping her understand why she felt compelled to control everything and everyone. She asked if she could visit someday when we're ready. And are we? I think we're strong enough now to help her heal too. Annalise turned to face him fully. Forgiveness isn't just about forgetting the past. It's about creating space for a better future. Their reconciliation had taught them both profound truths about love, trust, and the courage to begin again. The Academy had expanded, now offering programs specifically designed to help women rebuild their lives after setbacks and betrayals. Annalise's own story had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges. As moonlight silvered the castle stones, they danced slowly in their garden, no music needed beyond the rhythm of their shared heartbeat. Their love story had become something greater than themselves, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of true partnership, and the miracle of second chances. A message of hope to women who have known betrayal. To every woman who has felt the sharp sting of betrayal, who has seen her trust shattered and her dreams dimmed, your story isn't over. It's simply taking an unexpected turn towards something stronger, wiser, and more beautiful than you can imagine right now. Remember, your worth isn't determined by someone else's failure to see it. The pain you feel today is cultivating wisdom for tomorrow. Every ending creates space for a new beginning. You are stronger than any circumstance that tries to break you. Your heart's capacity to love again is a gift, not a weakness. Trust in your journey. Like Annalise, you may find that what feels like devastation is actually preparation for a greater destiny. Your tears water the garden of your future strength. Your struggles today are crafting the wisdom that will guide others tomorrow. Don't let someone else's betrayal become your life's definition. Let it be the catalyst that reveals your true resilience, the fire that forges your strength into something unbreakable. Your story matters, your healing matters, and your future is still full of possibilities waiting to unfold. Remember, sometimes life's greatest hurts lead us to our highest purpose. Your broken pieces, when gathered with courage and hope, create a mosaic more beautiful than the original picture you planned. Trust the journey. Believe in new beginnings. Your best chapter is still waiting to be written. Subscribe if you liked.